No, it's on all right. Good evening. I want to thank you for coming to the Brisbane Baylands Community Advisory Group meeting this evening. And we are very fortunate to have Dana Breckwald, beg your pardon, who is the program manager of the Bay Conservation and Development Commission's program Adapting to Rising Tides. I'm afraid I don't have Dana's background with the agency. Maybe she'd like to tell us about that.
Sure. Do you want me to?
Thank you. You'd have to come over to the microphone in order to be heard.
Great. Are you ready for me to start the presentation, or?
Let's go ahead.
Okay. So my name is Dana Breckwald. I work at the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. I've been managing the Adapting to Rising Tides program for the past year, and I'll talk to you a little bit about who BCDC is and what we do, what the Adapting to Rising Tides program is, and then what analysis that we have done that's relevant to this city and this location and its significance in the region. So my background is I'm an urban planner. I've been working on disaster, including earthquake and sea level rise issues for the past 10 years. My third regional agency, so I used to work for the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. But BCDC, I will start with, if you're not familiar, BCDC stands for the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and we are a statewide agency that has jurisdiction over the bay and the 100-foot shoreline band. And we have two arms. One side issues permits, that's the regulatory arm, for any development that occurs in the bay or in the 100-foot shoreline band. And then we also have a planning division, and the planning division is where my program sits, the Adapting to Rising Tides program. And that's where we look at how we plan for the future of the bay and the shoreline, and also help cities and counties get prepared for how they can implement local planning for the shoreline. So the Adapting to Rising Tides program, we really do a lot of developing protocols and process and assisting jurisdictions in planning for sea level rise and storm events specifically. So the Bay Conservation and Development Commission was created in 1965 because at that time there was a lot of unregulated fill that was occurring in the bay. So people were dumping in the bay, creating new land for development, and no one was controlling it. This slide shows that they suspected that if the fill had occurred at the rate that it was occurring in 1965, by 2020 the bay would be nothing but that little river you see there. So the Bay Plan, which guides how BCDC does our permitting, really is about preventing fill in the bay and preventing the bay from getting smaller. Well, now we're facing a completely opposite problem. As sea level rise occurs, the bay is actually expanding again. So we need to change the way we think about the management of the bay and the shoreline to understand what it means in the face of sea level rise. So the bay has always been a constantly changing ecosystem. It was changing before we got here. It was changing due to natural processes. It's been changing for a very long time due to human-made processes. So the gold rush in the 1800s in California dumped millions of tons of sediment down the delta and into the bay, changed the shoreline then. It's been changed through bay fill. It's changed through infrastructure, railroads, freeways, development, shoreline protection. So what we're doing here is really talking about how we are more conscious about managing the bay shoreline in the future. So this may seem like an incredibly obvious slide, but we've always had floods in the Bay Area, not just from storm surge and from the bay, but along the coast, and also due to riverine and stream flooding. But we also know that it's getting worse. It's getting worse due to increased storm surge as well as shoreline permanent inundation due to flooding. So I'm just going to walk you through right now some very basic concepts of flooding and how we measure both permanent and temporary flooding. So flooding can come from storms, tides, or sea level rise. And then the thing to note is that temporary flooding today shows us what permanent flooding could look like in the future. So for example, I live in Marin County, and 101 floods during king tides today, and it shuts down the freeway. People can't get to work. People can't get, from here to there. And that's temporary right now, and we can maybe live with it if it's a few days a year. But what happens when that flooding becomes permanent? So we already know that we've measured sea level rise already occurring in the Golden Gate, or in the San Francisco Bay. So there's a meter at the Golden Gate Bridge that has already showed 8 inches of sea level rise since the turn of the 19th century, and we're projecting 12 to 32 inches by 2050, in addition to that 8 inches. So temporary flooding can come from mainly two sources. The first one is storm surge. Storm surge is what happens when there are changes in pressure, wind, and river inflows from surges, or from storms. So these cause temporary abnormal rising sea levels, and they retreat. I'm sure many of you are also familiar with the concept of king tides. So king tides occur a couple times per year when the Earth is closest to the moon and the moon's pull of gravity. And when this occurs also with a storm surge, this can lead to extreme flooding around the region. So as I said, temporary flooding due to storm surge and king tides will shows us what permanent inundation could be like in the future, except it won't retreat. So sea level rise is on top of the mean high water currently, but as opposed to those temporary sources of flooding, it stays. So in the Adapting to Rising Tides program at BCDC, we use this concept called one map, many futures. So if from here on out, I'm going to refer to flooding as total water level, and we typically refer to it in inches as well. So this means that any total water level can be any combination of permanent sea level rise and storm surge. So this is an example where these are all on top of what's called mean high water, which is the average high tide. So that's sort of the average location along the shoreline where water reaches its maximum today. And then we can look at 24 inches of total water level can represent 24 inches of permanent inundation due to sea level rise, but it can also represent any combination, as I said, of temporary flooding and permanent inundation. So we can look at a 5-year storm, which would create 24 inches of storm surge and then retreat and go back to the mean high water. Or we can look at 6 inches of sea level rise with a 2-year storm on top of that, or 12 inches of sea level rise and a 1-year storm, or, as I mentioned before, 24 inches of sea level rise. So I'm going to show you some maps of your community that have total water levels on them, and those can be permanent. And I have a little table on it that shows what combination of permanent flooding and temporary flooding it represents. So it can be permanent, or that can show you in a nearer future what temporary flooding that community might experience. So another concept that is really important to communicate is this concept of shoreline overtopping. So the Adapting to Rising Tides program has an online mapping tool called the Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer. And one of the most interesting features of this map is that it shows the elevation of the entire bay shoreline and where that elevation is overtopped due to bay flooding. So if you have 24 inches of sea level rise, but you have a 36-inch flood control structure, then you're fine. It's not going to be overtopped. But if you have no flood control structure, then that represents the area where the water will go over the shoreline and overtop. And we can measure the depth of that overtopping as well. So, for example, if you have a 12-inch seawall and 24 inches of flooding, it will overtop, and that depth of flooding will be 12 inches. So the sea level rise will be 12 inches above what the shoreline elevation is currently today. So we have all of that shoreline elevation information for the entire bay shoreline, including the shoreline that you have out here. This is really important because it tells us where the water is coming in. It tells you where flooding is occurring. So flooding doesn't just occur widespread everywhere along the shoreline. There are usually specific points of overtopping, and those are the areas where you need to focus and protect and elevate. So the Adapting to Rising Tides program I mentioned before, it's a program in the Bay Area out of BCDC to increase the resilience of current and future Bay Area communities to sea level rise, storm flooding, and other current and future hazards. So we do this primarily through outreach to local governments, helping governments do better planning, make better decisions about what the future of their shoreline is going to look like. But a main component of it as well is also educating residents who live within the communities that are going to be impacted, because who influences public policy more than elected officials is the voters. So it's really important for everybody who is going to be exposed to sea level rise to understand where you're at risk and what you can do about it and how you can get engaged with the decision making in your community. So just really quickly, the art program, our focus is this three-pronged approach. We integrate sustainability into everything we do, and this is not just environmental sustainability. So we do look at things like ecosystem services, natural areas that are going to be inundated, what's going to happen to the wetlands, but we look at society and equity. A really big component of ours is looking at the community members and whether they're socially vulnerable. We do know that socially vulnerable communities are disproportionately impacted by sea level rise because they just don't have the resources to be able to move or elevate their homes or make different decisions around housing and improving their ability to recover from a disaster. We also look at I mentioned that already, economic sustainability. So how will the regional economies be impacted? For example, if the airport shuts down because it's flooded, what does that have to do with our imports and exports? And governance, a big component of planning for sea level rise is understanding that there's a huge complex web of local governments, cities, counties, special districts, owners, managers, regulators. There's a myriad of owners along the shoreline that all have to coordinate together in order to decide what's going to happen for climate adaptation. I mentioned collaboration is a big component of our program. We meet regularly with a wide variety of stakeholders. It's why I come out and talk to people like you. I've talked to a lot of community groups because I think it's really important that people are educated on what's going to be happening in their communities and how to talk to your government about it. And then that also feeds into this transparency. A huge part of what the Adapting to Rising Tides program does is we document everything we do. We document our process. We create worksheets, how-to guides, sample agendas, all those sorts of things so governments can create their own local process. So speaking of process, this is the art planning process. What we really do is sort of help people figure out what stakeholders need to be at the table, what sort of process they need to go to, do a really robust vulnerability assessment. So vulnerability assessment doesn't just mean looking at what gets wet and when, but it's looking at what are the impacts of that. So if a vulnerable community, if a neighborhood that is low income gets wet, what are the implications of that beyond just the fact that their houses are being flooded? And then a really important component of this as well is the plan step, which is coming up with adaptation responses that are specifically unique to vulnerability, not just flooding, but those add-on vulnerabilities like the fact that businesses may, lose money or go out of business, the fact that there's really complex governance along a certain shoreline segment, things like that. So it's not just about building a seawall, but it's about building capacity and collaborating and coming up with solutions together as a community as well. So the big project that we're working on right now that I will share some of the findings of that are relevant to this community is called Art Bay Area. So we've done a number of projects locally with local communities. We did one in Alameda. We did one in Contra Costa County. We're working with East Contra Costa and the Delta right now to do vulnerability assessment. But right now we're doing one that shows sort of what are the systems that are regional in nature so that if say 101 does go down in Marin County, how does that impact the commute of everybody in the region? So if the airport goes down, it doesn't just affect the community immediately surrounding the airport, but it affects the economy of the region as a whole. So we're looking at these big systems and how local vulnerabilities play into region-wide impacts. So as I mentioned, we've collaborated with a lot of community members, with a lot of organizations. One of our biggest partners actually is San Mateo County. So we've worked quite a bit with them. They have a new Office of Resilience and Flood Control that's doing some really wonderful things. We've done a bit of community engagement actually with 2 community groups in East Palo Alto and in Contra Costa County. So that goes back to this importance of educating community members, getting people involved, people who normally wouldn't be involved in government or governance decisions, and also helping to connect the issues of sea level rise to things that people care about today. So for example, in East Palo Alto, we talked about the fact that they had a lot of concerns about their water quality and how rising groundwater and sea level rise would impact that. So in Art Bay area, we looked at these 4, we call them asset categories, which is kind of a wonky way of saying regional systems. So the first one we looked at is transportation infrastructure. We looked at everything from ferries to buses to Caltrain to cargo rail, airports, seaports, freeways, local roads, ferry systems. We looked at future growth areas. So the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has a region-wide plan that designates areas called priority development areas. They're actually locally designated, but they get included in this region-wide plan. And these are areas where cities have said, okay, we want a lot of jobs and housing growth to go in these areas that are connected to transit and suitable for future development for many reasons, because they help people get around without producing greenhouse gas emissions. So we looked at the whole priority development area system throughout the whole region, as well as areas that are primed to be priority development areas. We also looked at natural lands through the lens of the opposite of priority development areas, which are priority conservation areas. And we looked at a number of ecosystem services that occur within those, including things like visitation or value of agriculture. We looked at habitats. We looked at carbon sequestration potential, all sorts of things that we want our wetlands and our natural lands to do for us. And then we looked at vulnerable communities. So as I mentioned, we already know that vulnerable community members are disproportionately impacted by things like sea level rise and storm surge. So we looked at the things like income or disability or elderly living alone, children under 5, people who don't speak English as their first language. All of these things make it harder for these people to be prepared for sea level rise. We looked at these systems across the region, and then we also dug into 32 different focus areas around the region that had a lot of these different types of assets that were co-located. Because one of the things that is sort of unique to this project is we're looking at shared vulnerability. So if you have a community, a vulnerable community, a priority development area, and a transportation asset, they're all getting wet because of the same point of overtopping, that's a real opportunity for all of those owners to collaborate and move towards an adaptation strategy, rather than, Caltrans saying, I'm just going to repair my piece of infrastructure here and not thinking about the community that is being protected by that piece of infrastructure. There are arrows. So now we're getting to some specifics of the community here. So one of the focus areas that we looked at was this priority. There's a large priority development area here called the San Francisco San Mateo Bi-County
Transportation.
Something. It's a very complex and long name, but it's a priority development area that crosses the jurisdictional boundaries and really encompasses this area right here. So we dug into it as one of our focus areas, and this is a snapshot of the Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer at 12 inches. So this could be 0 sea level rise. This could be a storm surge today, or 12 inches of sea level rise with no storm surge. So good news, you don't really see anything, do you? There's a tiny little area down here, and that red shows areas that are overtopped. So this is a low point in the shoreline, and it's going to experience a little bit of flooding. But everything else looks pretty good, right? That's the good news. Yes.
Oh, in the mic, actually. Asha has it.
Sorry. I'm curious about the difference between overtopping and groundwater inundation.
Yes.
And especially in the landfill area, because historically, if you look at Brisbane, even our community park was bay. And Crocker Industrial Park was bay. And so there's overtopping, yeah, you build a wall or whatever, but there's also inundation from groundwater rise that happens at the same time. And I'm wondering if your mapping and your is including that in your plans. And so I'm curious about, and then how far inland did you map?
That's a really excellent question. In our study, we only had the data region-wide to map shoreline overtopping. So overtopping is the water that's coming in over the shoreline. Groundwater is a huge issue, and we're actually working with the city of San Mateo right now. I have a call with them tomorrow to look at how we can do groundwater mapping around in San Mateo County. We're trying to get it for the region as a whole, but we're starting with San Mateo County. So even though these maps don't include it, it is something that is definitely being addressed by the county right now.
It is a critical issue in this development and in Brisbane in general, the lowlands of Brisbane, due to landfill
Yeah.
and the historical bay shoreline. So
Yeah.
even Crocker Industrial Park doesn't drain well. Our community park doesn't drain well at all. We've had flooding and inundation throughout that area.
Yeah, so that's another really good point that I want to make here is that we did sort of a how this is connected to regional systems and a focus area assessment that is fairly high level. So what I'm showing you here does not substitute for a detailed local assessment, but it's a starting point for looking at that. And also, we have the caveats that we didn't look at things like groundwater. We only looked at a select subset of these. So again, this is part of what the art program does is we'll put out some initial analysis and then help the city or county sort of work and dig in more detail to come up with adaptation responses that are extremely responsive to the vulnerabilities that exist there. So this is an entry point, but this doesn't tell the entire story.
Okay, but you will be telling the entire story as one of the lead agencies on this development, correct?
We will be telling the story of how it fits into the region as a whole, but it's not an in-depth local assessment.
But will there be one by BCDC?
No. I mean, if we partner with the city and the city wants to take that on, then that's one way of doing it. But we don't have the capacity. We have 4 staff, so we don't have the capacity to do an in-depth vulnerability assessment in every shoreline community.
I had a question about undergrounded rivers. That we have the historical maps of undergrounded rivers, and that as storms surge, they talk about how Mission Street and Valencia are formerly little rivers in San Francisco. Will the storm actually surge inward to a point where it's causing the mains in the street to pop up? Because we had that experience in Daly City in 1982 in places where you wouldn't expect there to have been flooding. And it was because their storm drain system just couldn't handle it.
Yeah, so that's as I understand part of what is going to be looked at through the groundwater study, because they'll map things like the depth of the water table, the types of soils that exist there, and any historical streams that exist or undergrounded streams. So we didn't do that in this study, but that's part of what a next phase of analysis would include. Yes.
In the photo that you showed there, you show 0 king tide and 12 inches of sea level rise. Do you have a slide that shows, let's say, 6 feet of storm surge and 12 inches of sea level rise, and then is there flooding at that point?
Yes, so the next one I have is 48 inches of total water level, which would be 6 inches of sea level rise plus a 100-year storm or any of those combinations of sea level rise and storm surge that you see there. So you can see here that it's still looking pretty good in terms of overtopping. There's some there's some additional overtopping down here that's leading to minimal flooding, and then up here in San Francisco, there's a bit of overtopping and flooding as well. So the threshold here that we really see is 84 inches of sea level rise. And I have a slide coming up that sort of correlates that with different, with the time horizon. But at 84 inches of sea level rise, that's when overtopping starts to occur on a more widespread basis along the shoreline here. And that's when 101 starts to get flooded, and it starts to move inland a bit here. So that's at 84 inches of sea level rise. I also have 96, so 84 inches of sea level rise is what we consider first exposure. And 96 inches of sea level rise is when a threshold occurs. So this overtopping, and then due to the elevation of the land down here, this is what we call a disconnected low-lying area. So the elevation here is lower than the elevation here. So if you have no path for water to come in, that's fine. But right here, you can see that there are some paths. There's a path here, and there's a path down here where overtopping will automatically find the lowest point of elevation and lead to potential flooding inland.
You talked about if there are, at 101 is a transportation asset, but there's also a regional petroleum distribution center that in this slide you're showing us flooded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how would that relate to the actions you would take, and what kind of priority would those things get based on what you were telling us before, because it affects a large part of the Bay Area? The petroleum facility supplies the airport.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to continue to tell the story about how this fits into sort of the regional picture. So first I want to talk about what these total water levels mean in terms of timing. So the Ocean Protection Council last year released their most recent projections about when they think, and you don't bother to try to read this whole slide because I know it's very complex, but this is basically the projections under 3 different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. On the left column here, there's a low risk aversion scenario, so that's sort of the low end of what we might expect. The middle column here is the medium high risk aversion. That's sort of the middle ground of what we'd expect. And then the right column here is if things are just accelerate really rapidly, and it's sort of the high end of what we might expect. So you'll remember that I showed you 12 inches of total water level. Under the medium high to extreme risk aversion, this is likely to happen somewhere around 2030. The next scenario that I showed you was 48 inches. This is likely to occur somewhere around 2070. And then the highest scenarios that I showed you, 84 and 96 inches, are probably not going to occur until 2100 or later. So, of course, this could all change when the next projections come out. If things are accelerating much more rapidly, obviously these sea level rise scenarios will be seen sooner. But according to the most recent projections, these are sort of the timelines that are currently associated with the total water levels that I showed you. Yep. And I'll also say I can give you the website of our Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer, and you can look at everything on your own computer. You can type in your address or any address of a location that you care about and toggle through all of these. We have 10 different total water levels that you can toggle through. So you are welcome to spend as much time as you want looking at these. If you click on those red portions, which means overtop shoreline, a little pop-up will come and it will show you what the shoreline is currently made of. So I believe a lot of this shoreline here is riprap. and what the depth of overtopping is. So you can see the elevation of the current shoreline and how much it would need to be elevated in order to be resilient to any given total water level.
Right now we have temporary soil piles on the area before the inundation happens. What kind of readings did we use for this level? Is that the temporary soil piles?
So the elevation,
Elevations.
yeah, the elevation data was taken from LiDAR, which is basically aerial photograph that like sends down like LiDAR data or LiDAR beams, and whatever was reflected back is the elevation data that we used. So I believe this was LiDAR data from 2016. So if they existed in 2016, then they probably made it into the LiDAR. So this says nothing about the quality of the shoreline. So obviously an engineered seawall is going to be more resistant to storm surge and flooding than a non-engineered pile of soil.
Yeah, these are all temporary piles of soil, so, okay.
Right.
thank
So
you.
that's a vulnerability. This only tells you the elevation and sort of what's there. It doesn't tell you how resilient it is. Yeah. Okay. So these are sort of the critical assets that we looked at in this community. The Caltrain rail line is first exposed at 84 inches. And the local road that we looked at was Sierra Point Parkway, which also gets wet at 84 inches. Brisbane Baylands is exposed at 94 inches. The lagoon starts to flood at 84 inches, and 101 starts to flood at 96 inches. So these are just first exposure. A couple of more qualitative vulnerabilities that we identified is we know that there's a lot of current industrial and previous industrial uses that have led to contamination. So this is one area where we need a lot more information about what's going to happen to contaminants as they're flooded. A lot of these locations that are remediated were remediated to dryland standards, and it's very different if you have, for example, groundwater intrusion or flooding that can pick up the contaminants and move them. So that's a big vulnerability. We don't know if the standards are sufficient. We don't know what standards will be needed in the future in order to protect sites that we are expecting to get wet from sea level rise or groundwater.
I mean, when do you anticipate knowing that?
I don't know. It's not my area of research. So there's a whole group of stakeholders out there who are doing research on this currently, but I don't have an answer to that. So as I mentioned, there's a big governance coordination issue here as well. The San Francisco-San Mateo Bi-County Area Priority Development Area is managed by 2 different cities and counties and crosses jurisdictional boundaries. The Caltrain is on track that's owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. So there's governance issues there because those have to be coordinated if that's going to be protected. Caltrans is obviously a stakeholder here, and then there are a number of local owners, developers, and shoreline users who have an interest in what occurs along the shoreline as well. And then I mentioned this here, potential riverine flooding sooner than sea level rise, but another issue that was brought up is potential flooding from groundwater intrusion as well. So these are sort of gaps in what we sort of know about vulnerability, but need more information before we can decide exactly what needs to occur along the shoreline to protect this community. The good news is that if 84 inches of sea level rise doesn't occur until 2100, that's more time than some other communities have to be coordinated and decide what should be done.
Just to be clear, this is based on modeling from the LiDAR data only, correct? No historical flooding data, none of that has been included here, right?
Yeah, so the only flooding exposure that we looked at was the shoreline data based on current shoreline elevation.
Okay, because we already have inundation and flooding in these areas. So I don't know what to say about the LiDAR data versus the reality on the ground now
Is it the groundwater intrusion flooding?
I don't know where all the water comes from. Some of it is runoff, some of it's not. Tunnel Road floods almost every year.
Yeah.
Multiple
right through the
times.
Baylands. Pardon?
Multiple times.
Multiple times a year.
time.
Deep water.
Yeah, deep.
And a lot of water, the central part of Brisbane's flooded several times.
Yeah, so that would be, I mean, that would definitely be an area of investigation for a more localized vulnerability assessment to look at.
Okay. And is the other division of BCDC one of the regulatory, it was my understanding that DTSC, BCDC, and Regional Water Quality Control Board were the agencies that were overseeing the Baylands development. Is that not the case?
So BCDC would only be issuing permits within the 100-foot shoreline band. That's the only role that BCDC would play in that.
Okay, thank you.
But the only thing is that you've talked, it isn't BCDC's position to be able to decide what standard the toxic contaminant should be when it goes from a solid to a more watery environment. Now, it isn't going to do any good unless somebody does something before all this happens, and it's a worry to me is that who's going to make sure that happens?
I mean,
Who is
I
the
hate to
overarching
look at
group?
DTSC,
Okay.
but that's more, it's outside of our scope. We don't deal with toxins or contaminants. That's not our department.
I realize that, but what I'm saying is that how will this be coordinated in order to say that happens, or that the money's there that happens? I realize you're maybe not, in this case, not as concerned because it's not till 2100, but there are other places that probably are going to flood sooner. So I guess I want to know what effort is being made to make sure that the coordination, not your responsibility, but whose responsibility is it? And when will that start, that to understand, all of the areas around the Bay Area that suffer from the same problems?
I mean,
Any
that's,
ideas?
yeah, I don't have an answer to that question. It was a vulnerability that we just identified in this project. So we are starting to do some outreach to different agencies and get more understanding of the issues. But we're sort of new to this issue, so I don't have an answer yet for you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? I have a couple more slides if we want to. So looking at how this community fits into the larger region as a whole, one of the analyses we did was identifying sort of the top 5 most regionally consequential assets around the region. So for example, if you're looking at the highway system, we broke it down by mile and looked at how many users used that section of the freeway every day. And then at these different total water levels, we identified the top 5 most heaviest used segments of freeway that were getting exposed. So that means that if those segments are non-functional because they're wet, there's going to be serious regional consequences because they're so highly used. So these are and then we added all of the assets from the transportation system, from the priority development system, from the priority conservation system, and as well as vulnerable communities, and located areas where they were co-located geographically. And these are the clusters that emerged. So some of them are pretty obvious. I think things like Oakland, Embarcadero along the shoreline there, San Jose. Martinez was a little bit of a surprise to us, and that's because they have a lot of oil refineries up there that have major impacts on the regional economy. But at 96 inches total water level, the focus area we're calling Brisbane Baylands emerged because of the railroad. It actually was not Caltrans. It was the UPRR because it was cargo it's an important rail for cargo. But compared to the rest of the region in terms of passenger rail, it didn't emerge as one of the most regionally impactful. But the priority development area, there are a huge number of jobs and jobs and housing that are scheduled to be going into this priority development area by 2040, one of the top in the region, as well as locations of contaminated sites that we're concerned about. So the last thing I'll kind of get to after all this stuff that can be sort of depressing and, what's going on and raising a lot more questions than it answers is sort of what can be done. So I think the important thing to note is that these maps show what flooding is going to occur in the absence of action. And, I know there's flooding that's occurring today, but if we're looking at this shoreline overtopping, as I mentioned, there's some time to decide what to do about it. And there are things that can happen both locally as well as, in community groups, as residents, as well as all the way up to the regional and state, that can happen that can help the region plan for climate adaptation. So a couple of points that I really think are very important is that decision-making should be shared. So it shouldn't just be the government saying, we're going to put a seawall there, we're going to permit that there, we're going to allow this person to build here in a sort of an ad hoc manner. But one of our big tenets is that communities should be involved. There should be community engagement. Residents should talk about what they want their community to look like in the future and what solutions will get them there. And then also paying for adaptation should be collaborative. So right now, every city pays for its own flood protection. But in the era of, certain communities that are getting wet first and certain communities that are not getting wet for a long time, certain communities have a lot more resources for planning and paying for things as opposed to other communities. And also certain communities have much greater disproportionate impacts in terms of what assets within the community are going to impact the region as a whole. So those are reasons for me that the region should come together and be collaborative about how we pay for climate adaptation rather than let each individual community fend for itself. That's only going to create winners and losers. So this is kind of the really generic advice that I give all community groups that I talk to, but the best way to get involved is to talk to your local decision makers. Go to city council meetings. City council members are responsive to voters. The same is true for state legislators. People make decisions that they think are in the best interest of their community, and if the community isn't asking for certain things, then decision makers often don't address them. One example of this is Measure AA, which passed recently and created the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. That's a regional agency, a newly created regional agency that has millions of dollars every year to pay for wetlands restoration. And that was an idea that people had a long time ago, but the voters weren't ripe for it because it required taxing themselves. And it took a long time. It took about 10 years of polling and creating capacity and talking to people on the ground and letting them know, how it would impact them for voters to be ready. And as soon as voters were ready, that went on the ballot and it passed. So voters really impact the way the decisions are made in the region. That's my next point. Vote for policies that support you and support adaptation. And then the other thing is to sort of spread this on the bottom level. So talk to your neighbors, talk to community groups, talk to other allies who can turn into people who will attend a city council meeting and vote for interests that impact what you care about here in your community. So this is my information. As I said, I'm sure that you have more questions now than when I walked into the room. That's fine. Go ahead and email me. I may not have answers. As you've seen, I don't have answers to all the questions here. And that's largely because this is a really, really complex problem. And it takes the coordination from anyone from, a homeowner who's in an area that's going to be wet all the way up to the state and federal level. So the more we talk and ask the right questions and sort of come to conclusions together about what to do, I think the better off we'll be. So feel free to ask me any questions, and if I don't know the answer, I'll say, that's a really good question. I should note that and talk to somebody about it. So are there any more questions right now? Yeah.
I was at a recent BCDC meeting dealing with the Sierra Point, and I want to ask kind of who is involved in honoring the public trust, because what I saw happen was that the developer got to raise the land, got to push out into our waterfront, but provide no development or no continuous waterfront should the future waters breach the shoreline. It almost seemed like it doesn't matter, we're going to lose the shoreline anyway. And I believe it was Mr. McGrath or the conservation gentleman. Conservation.
At BCDC?
At BCDC, who said that, don't worry about it, we've got it handled because we're going to do wetlands restoration elsewhere. And I felt that that was a real kick in the teeth because it didn't speak to the shoreline as being an integrated surface that the public has access to, that in the future the buildings will be there, they've been designed to deal with sea level rise, but the public's part and the environment's part of sea level rise is being totally overlooked. And so my question is, who is the person working in the public's interest for this? Because I see how clearly you're working very well for developers to come up with a solution for sea level rise.
Commissioner McGrath, yes. So one of the things that we're working on at BCDC is that we have this Bay Plan that dictates how we issue permits that is like really, really outdated. It was created in the 1960s. We've been going through a number of Bay Plan amendments. So last week, about a week ago, we passed a Bay Plan amendment that would allow for fill for habitat restoration. We're working on one next year for fill for flood control. We're passing, hopefully, knock on wood, passing one tomorrow on an environmental justice amendment that would ensure that projects have to consider impacts to neighboring communities, particularly vulnerable communities. So the other side of the planning division right now is working really hard to ensure that the Bay Plan and our policy document, basically what gives us authority and the degree of authority, is more reflective of the needs that we're seeing on the ground right now. Unfortunately, public policy is a really slow process. So these were envisioned about 10 years ago, and we're just getting around to passing them. And then it'll be probably a little bit more time until we really figure out how to apply them, and developers and cities figure out sort of what that means for how they develop along the shoreline. But it's, we're aware that there are limitations and holes in what BCDC is able to do given its authority. And so we're working on the Bay Plan amendments to help address some of that.
Thank you.
The question back here.
You need a
On our website.
Thank you for being here. My name is Paul Busquel, and I just wanted to share something with you. 10 years ago, I had an idea that I thought would be appropriate for the Baylands. And when you talk about the shoreline, Visitation Creek is tidal influx, so I assume that that's also shoreline that you would be within your jurisdiction. And I called Will Travis, who at the time was the director for the BCDC, because I thought before I even shared the idea, I needed to know if it was going to be possible. And what my idea was, because you also mentioned earthquakes and floods and sea level rise, was that the rail yard, which was once an industrial use, just like the salt ponds that they've spent close to $500 million for wetland restoration, which was also an industrial use. I had an idea of going next to the water, not touching it, digging out this area, cleaning it up, the rail yard, and building floating structures in and amongst wetlands. And Will Travis said, not only could that happen, that should happen for any low-lying areas, because seawalls aren't guarantees, and levees are definitely not guarantees in earthquake country and storm surges. So I thought, in the name of restoration like the salt ponds, the industrial use of the rail yards. We could build floating structures like they do in Holland and in Japan. Because you mentioned people aren't going to be able to raise their houses. Well, in soft soils and severe ground shaking, that's not going to support conventional structures. So I talked to Dave Pine about this. I've talked to Senator Jerry Hill about this, because Dave Pine seemed to be the person that could be of authority.
Yeah.
And I was hoping maybe you would consider that. I don't know if that's going to be possible for the Baylands, but definitely other low-lying areas.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a local local land use decision that would be made by each individual jurisdiction, whether that's permitted or zoned or not. But I believe that it would be permittable by BCDC. So if a community wants to go ahead and do that, that would be a really interesting and different kind of solution for climate adaptation.
I had a question concerning your the nature-based adaptation opportunities map for our area called Yosemite to Visitation. It's number 28 in the division of the Bay, and it shows that at least the folks who were looking at this were wanted to put near-shore reefs all from the bay, from the place where we intersect with San Francisco, all the way down to Sierra Point. And I was curious, and there's also, it shows the possibility of planting eelgrass all the way, really all the way out to where Candlestick Point is, if you just went directly south from that. And I'm curious, isn't it possible that it would be wise to try a first line of defense in using these natural adaptations, followed up by whatever would cost a heck of a lot more money and perhaps be more permanent and higher? But how are you thinking about this, about what you've done on this other map that you didn't mention this evening?
Yeah, I mean, so it's up, again, it's up to each individual jurisdiction, sort of how they want to prioritize. Our emphasis is always try green before gray, because you're right, it costs less. If you do sort of green infrastructure solutions or offshore solutions that attenuate wave run-up, then that reduces the amount of storm surge that you would need to protect against. So if you do, offshore wetlands restoration, and attenuate sea level rise and wave run up that way, then whatever hard infrastructure you have to put behind it at some point in the future is not going to have to be as tall. So it's not going to cost as much money, and you can put off doing it for longer if you're able to sort of manage lower total water levels through green infrastructure solutions. And as I mentioned, we just passed the Bay Plan Amendment that would allow for fill in the bay, which is what that would actually be. That would be considered fill for things like habitat management, and we're working on one for flood control. So we're getting to a point where that sort of work would be a lot easier to permit as well.
Is there any just speculation that it just sounds to me like I wouldn't want a heavy-handed state effort, but it just sounds like while you're doing a great job in what you're doing, and you're working to help everyone else collaborate, it seems like you need something else, something regional or state, in order to coordinate all these state-level agencies, county-level, independent, city, and federal, I guess. That seems like it's, listening to you speak, that seems like extremely important that happen. It would be extremely important how it was designed also. But it's like, is there anything you can say that isn't the official policy of any agency, but at least what people have speculated on is that how can we make this effort more effective sooner? If you do that, you're more likely to have the people involved. If everybody waits too long, then no one will, the governmental agencies won't be patient enough to want the people involved.
Yeah, so
And the money is a lot more contentious than I think you've been very diplomatic to say that's where people will be, throwing things at each other as to who pays, so.
Yeah, so the next project that we're actually launching after this project ends is a collaborative effort to establish some regional guiding principles, so that everyone sort of agrees on the direction that we're going towards, and identifying some regional priorities that are cross-jurisdictional, and therefore the region should step in and provide some support. We're thinking about what an ask to the legislature would be, about additional authorities perhaps for BCDC or for another regional agency, or in terms of funding. So we think that a regional funding source, where all the projects that are eligible for that funding source have to meet those guiding principles that sort of put the interest of the region together as a whole. So the closest things we have are the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, which is a regional agency that funds restoration projects. And then we also have the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has a regional plan called Plan Bay Area that looks at housing, jobs, and transportation for the region. The big challenge if you're a regional agency is that land use is inherently local. So all decisions about what it actually gets built occurs at a local level. So regional tools are pretty weak. We have funding. If we can put a funding source together and use that sort of as a carrot for jurisdictions to coordinate, that's a tool that we have. Even Plan Bay Area, that's a regional plan, it's a completely voluntary plan. No one is beholden to it. Lots of people hate it. So there are real challenges. I mean, real sort of systemic policy governance challenges to creating some sort of larger tool. And our thinking at this point is that it's probably a funding tool.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you if you could provide us with your presentation slides, so that we would have them to be for the group and for the public.
Yeah, I provided it to the city.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn.
The video.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the notes are like totally wrong, so don't share that part if you can.
Can I ask one question? On the vulnerability cluster map you had, you said that we were one of the 5 hotspots in Brisbane. Was that correct?
Yeah, so each of these that are circled here are an area at this 96 inches where there are 3 or more assets that are really regionally important, either a transportation, priority development area, or priority conservation area, or a vulnerable community. So these are the areas where they're co-located.
Thank you.
Are there more questions? Well, thank you very much.
Yes,
That
and
was
don't
outstanding.
hesitate to email me. I know this is there's a lot going on here, so I'm happy to answer questions in the future.
We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's sort of overwhelming. We're all thinking about all the possibilities that can happen. It's kind of like hard to change subjects. Well, thank you for doing that job.
We had a 3.2 earthquake within the last week, too.
Our next speaker is Nicole Yuen, who is the project manager for California Department of Toxic Substance Control for the Schlage site in San Francisco and Operable Unit San Mateo, previously known as OU1 Brisbane, and the site of the previous rail yard.
Okay. So I'm just here to give a status update. I believe that was the agenda, and kind of to go over what I've been doing on this project in the past 3 months. So I know most of you already know about the naming conventions. Asha and I thought it would be best to go over it again in case anyone missed it last time. So in 2008, DTSC issued a consent order where we renamed the site, so Schleglock and Southern Pacific Brisbane sites were redefined, and we're separated in 3 operable units. So there's the Schleg OU, UPC OU San Francisco, and then UPC OU San Mateo, previously known as OU1. All the volatile organic compounds, also known as VOCs, in soil and groundwater are considered part of the Schleg OU. So we have approved the first quarter 2019 groundwater monitoring report, the operations and maintenance plan.
Nicole, could I ask you to speak just a little bit slower? I think it's hard for the audience to follow because you're moving at a high rate of speed.
Okay.
Thank you.
We are still currently reviewing the 5-year review. I think that's on the next slide. We're working on an operation maintenance agreement right now and 2 land use covenants for the southeast portion and the sliver area. The sliver area is in pink. You can see the Schleg OU is split into 2 land use covenants. There's land use covenant north, land use covenant south, and then the area in red is the land use covenant southeast portion. And so we are working on those land use covenants right now. So this is a quick recap of the remedy at the Schleg site. So there was soil was excavated, on-site treatment by aeration, and the soil was reused. Excavation of some soil that had concentration of metals that exceeded cleanup levels, and that was relocated and capped on site. And institute groundwater remediation of groundwater contaminated with PCE and its daughter products. In UPCO USF, there was further excavation of metals impacted soil, and 2 land use covenants have been placed on the site so far. So the purpose of a 5-year review is to ensure that remedial action remains protective of public health, and it's required by the National Contingency Plan and CERCLA, which is also known as the Superfund program. So this is the basic outline of a 5-year review. The most important part of a 5-year review is the technical assessment, where 3 questions must be answered. So is the remedy still functioning as intended? Are the exposure assumptions, toxicity data, cleanup levels used at the site still valid? And has any other information come to light that could call into question the protectiveness of the remedy? And based on the answers to these questions, recommendations are made as to whether the site is still protected or not, and then there's a protectiveness statement. So Geosyntec gave us the 5-year review in May. We gave them comments back on the 5-year review in September, and it has been reviewed by me, toxicologist, and a geologist. This is a quick, Asha thought it would be best if we had a quick rundown of what land use covenants are. So land use covenants are used when contamination is still present at a site at concentrations greater than unrestricted use levels. And so the decision document, so in this case it would be the FSRAP, identifies the future land use restrictions, and they're recorded with the county, and they run with the land and bind all current and future owners. So even if the land was sold to a new entity, the land use covenant will still be in effect and would still be binding on the new owners. Annual land use inspections are required. Most require 5-year reviews, and DTSC has authority under the following legal codes to place land use covenants. So,
Nicole, I'm sorry, Madison, go ahead.
Oh, no, I wasn't trying. I don't have a question.
I see. The LUCs are both in San Francisco,
yes, because we have not done anything in San Mateo yet.
and the answers to the 3 questions on the technical assessment, what are those answers? Do you have those answers yet?
Not off the top of my head.
No, it just, you said that was the most important part of
Yeah,
it.
yeah, they're evaluated in the report. That's essentially the purpose of the report, is to evaluate those 3 questions.
Okay, and but off the top of your head, it's not really to that point yet, is that it? The 5-year review?
It's been a while since I looked at it, so it is protective, and there's future actions recommended. So we are looking at a few more groundwater injections, but I haven't looked at the document.
Oh, no, you're doing great, because that's 2 of the 3, huh? So So at a future time, you'll let us know about that which is not yet completely settled.
Yes, yes. So as part of the 5-year review, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, the public is meant to be involved in the 5-year review. So if you have any questions or concerns or any information about the site that could call into question the protectiveness of the remedy, you all have my email. Is it available online? No, it's still in a draft form, so it is not available online.
What is the sliver area? Why is that a separate designation?
So the sliver area is going to be part of the development that's supposed to break ground in spring 2020. And so it made sense for the development to have that entire area under a land use covenant. So it's the sliver area is part of UPC OUSF, which was the last portion of the site to be completed, to be remediated. So that's why it wasn't included with the rest of the land use covenants, which were completed in 2014, because that work at UPC OUSF wasn't completed until, I want to say, about 2017. So just to make sure that that entire area is covered, we're doing a land use covenant to cover the sliver area.
Okay.
There's nothing covering that piece right now.
Okay. I'm not quite sure that answers my question
Wh-
completely.
Why
but-
why wasn't there something that covered that?
Because it wasn't completed until 2017. So it's part of UPC OUSF. So UPC OUSF wasn't finished until, I think it wasn't finished until I picked up the project. So 2017, 2018, whereas the rest of the site, Schlegel U was done around 2014.
Done being remediated.
Done being remediated. So that's why they would put the land use covenant there. Because it was done in phases.
And how many years was that in process to get to the land use covenant?
Are you asking how long it took to implement?
Yes.
The FSRAP for the Schleg site was approved in 2009, and the land use covenant was signed in 2014. So about 5 years, perhaps. Probably less than that, because after the FSRAP for Schleg was approved, we still had to do the remedial design implementation plan, and then the actual field work could start. So I would say about 4 years.
I wonder if we could go back to the three things in the technical assessment, and would you mind preparing something brief for us so that we could just send it out to rather than asking. I think it would be a little more complete if, since it's such an important issue, and this is a 5-year review, if the three answers to the questions in just a brief format, which you gave 2 of them in a brief format, and if you could just give them 3, I'd sure appreciate it. Make sure that everybody gets one, and it would also then be available to the public.
Would this be when we finalize the 5-year review?
If
I can
that's
pull
the best
something
time.
together and send it around. Yeah,
That
I'll work
would
with
be
Nicole
good.
to do that. Yeah.
Because there'd be more information, so just that much would be helpful.
Okay. So for UPC OUSM, also known as OU1, the FSRAP, DTSC provided comments in July and September. Vivek Mathrani, Marika Hughes, myself, my supervisor, and Chris Law, DTSC's legal counsel, have reviewed it. The EIR addendum, we are reviewing that as well. It's part of our obligations under CEQA. And we are currently working on the public participation plan. So there will be a community survey mailed out by the end of this month. Is that optimistic?
Sometime this year.
A community survey will be mailed out.
And there needs to be a public meeting, isn't that correct?
Yes, so the public meeting will be scheduled when DTSC has approved the draft FSRAP for public comment. So that at that point, DTSC says, we think this is ready to go out for public view. Like, we're okay with it, and now let's see what the public thinks. So the public meeting won't, we haven't even approved the draft FSRAP yet for comment, so it won't happen until, yeah, probably.
Next year.
So the community survey will be mailing out to about 7,500 people. Is that 7,500?
I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but
Something like that.
I'm thinking more 5,000.
75
5,000? Oh, we cut it. Okay.
addresses.
Yeah, it includes Viz Valley and Daly City as well.
And all of Brisbane. And that community survey will just gauge the community interest, how you would like us to reach out, any languages that need to be translated, specific demographics like that. And then as part of the public participation plan, because this is an FSRAP, Asha and I will be conducting community interviews with community members some point this year.
We'll be gathering the information, and we'll see the responses that we get. We want to make sure we cover all the areas. Of course, Brisbane's important. We want to make sure we also speak to folks in Daly City and Viz Valley as well.
So we're currently reviewing the FSRAP. VOCs that are present on the UPC OUSM will be addressed under the RAP for the Schleg OU because, as I've discussed before, they are technically part of the Schleg site, and therefore they would still be addressed under the remedy for the Schleg site. So the proposed remedy at this project: land use controls, capping soil, excavation, relocation, and capping of soil that contains contaminants of concern at concentrations exceeding cleanup levels, and then the operation and maintenance of the caps. This is the cleanup process. So as you can see, we're still fairly early in the process. We're still in the remedy selection part. And then once we do get the FSRAP approved, we still have to go through the remedial design where everything is laid out. And then it's the implementation, and then the land use covenant and O&M plan and agreement before the site can be certified. So here are the next steps. UPC will submit the revised FSRAP to us for review. The public outreach Asha and I discussed earlier will take part. We will definitely have future public meetings. We're required to have at least one, but I'm assuming, I know we're going to have more than that. And then at that official public meeting, the public can officially submit comments on the FSRAP, and DTSC will be putting together responses to all those comments.
And FS stands for feasibility study.
Feasibility study, yes. And then once all the comments are addressed, the FSRAP will need to be approved, and before any field work starts, a remedial design implementation plan, you might have heard of it as an RDIP, will need to be approved by DTSC before any ground gets broken.
Could you comment on the idea before any ground gets broken? That seems quite logical because it's just a remedial design implementation plan, meaning that you haven't really quite finished, it sounds like.
The remedial design implementation plan is really more like the blueprint. So, for example, a site I have in Santa Rosa is a dry cleaner, and we did a removal action work plan where we said we think the best remedy for this site would be to do injections. And it was approved, and then it wasn't until the implementation plan that we said we're going to inject in these 54 locations along these streets, and we're going to use, it's like 100,000 gallons and inject it at this rate here in these locations, and then we're going to do all of this pre and post sampling to make sure it's actually working. So all the hard details aren't really hammered out until the RDIP, where you're like, okay, this is what we're going to actually do on the field.
I guess, so it wouldn't be until you had made a determination that the remedy actually worked that anybody would be able to do anything to the land, correct? It would be, in other words, until the remediation had occurred to the point where that it was safe for in this case, commercial use. It's a little different case because this is a existing dry cleaners. Is that, in other words, what I'm concerned about is the way you're stating it. It is unclear whether you will allow people to build before you know the results of the remediation, whether it worked or not.
Oh, I see. No, the site will need to be certified first. There's definitely, by ground being broken, I meant the start of our field work, remediation field work, not the construction and actual podiums and all of that. I meant the implementation of the FSRAP.
So when you guys do a feasibility study, that looks at the type of treatments that the land is going to get, and also the cost and feasibility of how much it's going to cost to the property owner? And is that weigh in how clean you think things should be or need to be?
Cost is one of the 9 criteria that we use to evaluate a remedy in an FSRAP. It's not the deciding criteria. The deciding criteria is this remedy going to work, and is it going to be protective, and is it going to last? Those are the main things we look at. Cost is a criteria, but it's not the threshold criteria. I think it's how it's discussed in the NCP. That's the one that has to be met. And so if it's not protective and if it's not effective, we wouldn't even consider it. So cost is part of it. Legally, it's required, but it's not the deciding factor.
Any more questions? Well, thank you. That clarified many different points. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
I'm concerned how we can approve a development plan before we know the results of this. I mean, what if it dramatically changes what they're planning to build where, or what the remediation plan is? Is it normal to approve a development agreement before, or a development plan before this part has been done?
The development plan has not been approved yet, though.
Okay.
Like the actual, are you asking about the actual layout of all the build? That has not been approved. So if I remember Measure JJ correctly, the FSRAP needs to be approved for UPC, OUSM, OU2, and the landfill, the closure plan for the landfill, before the city will even contemplate development plans.
And have you done a closure plan for the landfill?
The closure plan is under the water board's jurisdiction, so that's that would be with Vic Powell, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicole, was there anything else you wanted to tell us?
No, I don't. I think that's it. Yeah, but the community survey should be getting mailed out at some point this year. And
Will there be any kind of a preliminary, like, we're going to send you a community survey, or you know, any
I can
way-
send you a heads up if you'd like before it comes.
No, well,
you can
not
take a
just
sneak
from-
peek at the questions.
it wasn't that. I wondered, you know, if people get so much mail, email,
Gotcha.
text, everything else, is there some warning to help them to know this is coming?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share it with whoever would be helping me, distribute it. I'll, ask folks who are on social media, ask the city, whoever would be willing to share
I
it.
had to mind,
Great.
sort of like something to talk about how important this is.
Okay, yeah, great idea. Thank you. Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah, do you think that would help? Something with a little bit more that doesn't look so government-like, with some color?
Would. Now, whatever we can do to make it.
If it did?
People will
Really?
pay
Okay.
attention.
We'll stick with our tried and true then.
It would be better if
Oh,
it did look like it
gotcha.
came from
Okay.
government.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. That was really helpful. And under BBCAG Matters, we are going to have a toxicologist come to a future meeting to respond to our questions, and we will try to schedule it when a toxicologist from DTSC is available. Perhaps that could be in the spring? What do
Yeah,
you
we can
think?
make arrangements for that. That would be fine.
Vic
Yeah.
Powell will be here as a principal speaker, but there would be time to have another speaker. And I think everyone who's here might want to note that he's going to speak on the OU2 data gap analysis that was referred, the investigation was referred to at the meeting in July. So I know you're all kind of just wait with bated breath for that to happen. And are there any public comments or suggestions to the BBCAG? Yes, Michelle?
It might be good to have these just a little bit more frequent during this time when there's a lot of information available. I'm glad that we're having it here, so there is an opportunity for more public involvement, and that it's being recorded so that the public can actually catch up with what's going on.
I'm very grateful to the city and also to DTSC for their help. If I understand this correctly, and Carolyn is back here, maybe she, it's rather important that DTSC sponsor the request. So perhaps, if I understand this correctly, that if DTSC makes a request for the use of the room, we may be able to use it again. And Mr. Vilken generously said that he would pay for the technicians that are needed for each meeting. And so you were just saying you thought we should have more meetings.
Yeah, it looks like the next one's not scheduled until next May.
That's right.
I think that's a long time away, considering all the stuff that's going on. It might really be beneficial to maybe have one in between, or maybe a catch-up one to bring people up to speed with everything that's been gone over.
We've had some difficulty getting a quorum, and it was requested that we reduce the meetings, the number of meetings. But I can see why you're saying that, and as time goes on, we could try to do that. And I'd like to mention that we have two people who are in the audience this evening who may be submitting applications. So we do need more volunteers, more members of the BBCAG going forward. The BBCAG was initiated by Dana Dilworth, and the first meeting was held in the spring of 2005. So we're going on 15 years, and I think there's some fatigue that sets in among the members, especially those who have been here for 15 years. So yes, I think that that's something we should definitely consider, and we'll see how things develop with DTSC and the regional board as far as what kind of a meeting we might have sooner. I thought that we would get more people from the public here. I'm glad that it's recorded, and so that anyone who is interested can go to the city's YouTube
Channel.
in order
Brisbane's,
to see this, the presentations that were given tonight. Go ahead, Prem.
So, yeah, I have a question about the BBCAG website. What is the progress been on that so far?
It's been very slow. It's been very slow. We need a volunteer to help with that.
Right, I mean, I might be able to help with that. The question is funding, because there will be organizations that offer website building, but they don't offer for a fee. I can build a website easily with one of those organizations, but it comes at a...
I think I have seen the pricing, and it's low. And it's low, yeah. I think that we can find donations to pay those fees.
To create the site and then post all of these slides and everything directly on the BBCAG site,
what kind of funding is typical for building a website like that? I mean,
They're going to charge you something like $230. I mean, I'm talking
Oh.
about per year. I'm talking about a site, a company that I personally use to build a website of my own for my company. They are actually, most of the people who work for that company, it's called Webley. They're actually in Ukraine, for, you know, and that's probably.
Oh, dear.
So because of that, their prices are actually better than some of the companies that are better known, like WordPress and so forth. So
What about Wix? Did you just say Wix?
Wix is another one.
But that's very cheap if you're
So,
cheap in the way that you design the site.
Right.
You know, I think
we're not, BBCAG doesn't need to have anything, elaborate. It just needs.
No, I agree. Well, it would be fantastic if you were willing to do that, and we could, especially using the Wix kind of model for the money. That I think that could be done, because that's like less than $100.
Okay.
Yeah,
So if you would like me to look into that and see if we can get that rolling, I'll be happy to.
All right, I would. I would, because I think that you stated earlier, Prem talked to me about this before, and he, I agree with him that it's like if you don't have a website, you don't exist. So, and so that's why I think it would be excellent just to have the minutes, agendas, and when we can get slides, or actually a link to the city's YouTube channel in order to allow people to watch this. It would, I think I think it's important that we do that as soon as it's convenient for you. It would be great with me.
I mean, in the current collective psychology, if you don't have a website, just like you said, essentially nobody's going to find you. So let me see what I can do.
Thank you very much, Prem.
The mic.
Okay, go ahead.
If you're going to mail out a survey, you will update your mailing list. My father has been getting noted.
Unfortunately, over the years, and he's still receiving our postcard. Is that right?
Yeah, he's been dead almost 11 years.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that.
I have an answer for you.
Well, that's
So we recognize it was a aging mailing list, so we ordered a new mailing list. So we will be using a fresh one. It'll go out to all of Brisbane and portions of Daly City and Viz Valley. So I wish you had told us that before. I'm sorry. You gave up? Oh, well, hey.
So that's why I'm like,
Well, thanks for coming.
what? That's great that you found it.
Oh, that's right. The
That's why
little
I'm late.
white dog.
Well, thank you very much for the suggestion and for the volunteerism also. Any other comments or suggestions, questions? Well, thank you all for coming and for staying to the bitter end. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon. If we if it seems appropriate to have a meeting sooner than May, then we'll do so. And we'll start notifying you, give you enough time so you'll be able to put it on your schedule. Oh, there's one item that didn't get done. And then it's an update from Howard Pierce. I'm staring straight at him. Please, Howard.
I thought I dodged a bullet there. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an update. In
Thank
the
you.
Schlegel Lock site, we are working with the city of San Francisco. We finally have their attention, and we're developing a set of improvement plans and hope to have that permitted by the end of this year and begin work first quarter of next year on building the streets.
That's on the whole project?
On the northern part of the site. Right, that's phase one. And then, so that's San Francisco. Nicole did a pretty good job of outlining what's going on with the DTSC. We're also working with Vic Powell at the Water Board to do the FS wrap for the southern, the part of the rail yard, the OU2 area. And so that's, we're also just barely scratched the surface on the landfill closure plan. So all of those are working kind of at the same pace. The OU1 area, the UPCOUSM area is a little bit ahead of those other two plans. The other thing that we've got going is you probably know about our community workshop number 3. That's this Thursday, so you're all invited to attend. I believe that's at 6:30, and that's at the Mission Blue Center. So that's.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for you, actually. With regard to the Schlaglock kind of area, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but close to the intersection of Geneva and Bayshore Boulevard, during the heavy rainy seasons, that whole area is pretty much flooded. And I wanted to know if
That's in Brisbane, and
Yeah.
that's part of the dividing line between the UPCOUSM, also known as OU1, and the OU2 area is the extension of the center line of Geneva. So that is a Brisbane thing. It's not Schlaglock. And the grading plan and the infrastructure plan that BKF is working on in conjunction with the development will address the 100-year flood. And it'll also take into consideration the sea level rise that we just heard about.
Well, you said 800-year flood?
No,
100-year, okay.
flood.
The reason I'm asking is because just during regular rainy season, I'm not even talking about extremely heavy rain, that whole area, the surface water just sits there for days and days and days.
And that's because it's a very flat, low-lying area, and the new grading plan that we're proposing will address all that, and it will drain perfectly
Okay, all
once
right,
we're done.
thanks.
Thank you very much. So the meeting is adjourned. Again, thank you for coming.